actual Christmas story is going to be read all around the world by thousands upon thousands of people, and they get it from the gospel accounts. One of the most famous ones is the one in the Peanuts gang, when little Linus goes out and he reads that. Now, just so I can know if I should take that reference away, if you're below the age of 20 or 25, have you ever seen the Peanuts story, 25 and below? Okay, it's good. Okay, so that's from Luke. And I think every year, though, around the world, when we do so without realizing actually whose words we're actually reading. Because there was only one person who was actually there at the very beginning, and that person was there at the very end, still alive. There was only one person who could have conveyed the entire story to the writers of the gospel, and that person was, of course, now think about it, some of you youth groupers and Eastland kids, you're just going to yell out, Jesus, because you've been indoctrinated, right? Who's the only person who could have told the writers of the Gospels everything that happened from the beginning to the end of the Christmas story? Mary. That's right, right? From the aha guy even. Good job. It's actually Mary. And so I just want you to change everything tonight and just think about this. In many ways, the Christmas story, it's actually Mary's story. And I want you to understand that because it is a real story. It has real emotions. It has real people. And yet we've added things to the story that Mary really didn't say. And two things I just want to say as we're moving through Life Point. The two things I want you guys to get is this. Our starting point for everything we do from up here is we want to actually give you the real gospel. We want to actually be accurate in how we handle it. And one of those is we want to be accurate in understanding that these accounts were written by real people, and they were referencing real cultures and real things. And we also are impacted by our culture. And so we want to be accurate, and we want to strip away many of the things that our culture has actually taught us about what we believe about our faith, but is actually found nowhere in Scripture. And so we want to be accurate. And so, with those two things in mind tonight, I just want to look at the story of Mary. And Mary's story actually begins with a story of a teenage girl excited about a wedding that she would never have. Already, things we've never considered. So let's go back 2,000 years, this tiny town in Israel named Nazareth. And let's give you some background on wedding practices in the first century of Israel. In first century Israel, men were expected to be married by the time they were 18. Now, women were expected to be married when they came of childbearing years. So we're talking 13 to 14 years old. And while that may bother us, culturally speaking, that's where it was in the first century. And so even though the parents would arrange these marriages, parents would get together and arrange it, if the two parties were not interested, they weren't pushed into this. They had to be interested. So what do we know right away? We know the ages, and we know that they were actually, they were interested in each other. And so we know that Mary begins her story shortly after the marriage had been agreed upon during this first year, which would be called the betrothal period. And during this betrothal period, the marriage had been set, but there was a 1-year period in which they were legally bound together. I want you to understand that. They were legally married, but they had to live apart. And in that time of living apart, and this is huge, with zero physical intimacy of any kind, during that year, Mary would have been at home with her father's house, still helping him out, earning wages there, working. And Joseph, he would have been preparing a place in his father's house, a room in his father's house to bring his bride. Or in the case of Joseph, who was a carpenter, maybe he was making an entire house for her. But he was also doing two other things. Joseph would have been working with Mary's father in the terms of compensation. You see, in the first century Israel, everybody contributed to the home, and so he was taking away a wage earner, like I said. So there had to be compensation. And in that year, Joseph would have been working on that. But also another thing, which was actually very real, that in the first century it was a hard time. And so the very real threat of death was around them, and so they had to work out an insurance of some kind that he would pay Joseph's father, that Mary's father would have for Mary, in the case that Joseph died young, in which case we don't know how he did, but we know that he did. that actually, jumping ahead in the story, he did die young. But anyway, those are things that were happening. And it was during this betrothal period that Mary begins her story. And I want you to think about that. It would have been a time of great excitement. She was looking forward to the day when this year was complete and what would happen. She'd been to many weddings, I'm sure, in this small town. She had probably been a bridesmaid of her own. On that day, when the year was complete of the betrothal period, Joseph would get together with his best friends. He would dress up in his very best clothing, and he would march with his friends, and the community would follow behind them to Mary's father's house, where Mary, dressed beautifully, would be waiting. Then Joseph's friends, one of them, the best man, would act as an MC for this entire 5 to 7 day wedding feast that was coming. And they would get Joseph's bride. They were married, betrothed, but that was the extent of it. They had not come together yet. They would grab Mary and they would put her on those litters, one of the things where they would carry. And the whole community, everybody she knew, would form a procession as Joseph and his friends carried her to Joseph's father's house. And the whole time, the entire community would be singing to this very faithful girl songs from the Song of Songs. We know the Song of Solomon, songs of love, ballads of love and commitment. And they would then take her to Joseph's father's house, where he would greet them and he would give them a blessing. And then she knew what was going to happen, that they would take her and her bridesmaids to this room, and they would prepare for the next day, the day of the great wedding feast to begin. Now Joseph, the guys still in those days, they got the better end of every deal, didn't they? Joseph got to hang out that night with the whole community, and he got to dance and to drink non-alcoholic beverages, sparkling cider. He got to, right? Probably not. And they had a good time while Mary waited the next day. So the next morning, they came and got Mary, and she and Joseph, again, dressed resplendently. They would go down to the father's house, and they would get their blessings from the religious leaders. And then they would party. They'd party all day long, and the great wedding feast began. At the end of the very first day of the wedding feast, and Mary, looking forward to this, Joseph, looking forward to this, was that night, of the first night, Joseph and Mary would go to the home that he had planned for her for the first time as husband and wife. And then, waking up the next morning, 5 days of solid partying with everybody who had ever meant anything to her. This was what she was looking forward to. And then an angel shows up. And Mary realized that she would actually have none of that. I just want you to consider that. An angel shows up, and Mary realized that she would have none of that because the angel Gabriel tells her that she's going to become pregnant. And she keeps it to herself, but that would have had to have been something quite amazing, very confusing. She's going to become pregnant with the Son of God, and so she doesn't know what to do. And like I said, the Bible makes it clear. She makes it clear. She's telling this story. She keeps it to herself, but she doesn't know what to do. So she travels to visit her elderly cousin, Elizabeth, who is also miraculously pregnant with a son who is eventually going to be John the Baptist. And she confides in Elizabeth, and they stay for a while. But the time comes that she has to head back to Nazareth. She has to go back and tell Joseph. And so she does, and I can imagine Joseph's excitement. The year is coming to an end. We don't know how long, but how excited he was to see her. But how quickly his excitement quickly turned to confusion, to hurt, to betrayal, to anger when he discovers that she's pregnant. And I want you guys to think about this. Real stories, real people, real emotions. Joseph's pain he felt. Obviously, none of this made sense. We know the character of Mary, and the only story as he was trying to figure out what is going on, how did this happen? The only thing she can say is God did it. Pain, disappointment, and now she's a liar in his eyes. Just tell me the truth. So now, as Mary had known that it would, since the angel Gabriel had said that she would become pregnant, her fate lay in Joseph's hands. Ever since the angel had said, you will become pregnant, She knew from that moment on that this day was going to arrive when Joseph would decide her fate. And so she awaited his decision. Because if he put her out into the community publicly and divorced her publicly, she could indeed be killed. It was in his hands. And so she waited, and for how long, she doesn't tell us. But we do know that Joseph decides what he'll do. You see, he was kind, and he was in love, and he was hurt, but he was still Joseph, the man that God himself had chose to raise his son. So he decided to protect her. He said, I'm not going to make public your shame, but I will divorce you. We will no longer be husband and wife, but I'll do it privately. So he goes to bed that night, hurt. Everything he had hoped for, the home he had prepared, empty. The wedding they had wanted, not to be had. In the middle of the night, his dream, where an angel of the Lord appears to him and says, Joseph, she is telling you the absolute truth. So Joseph, this man of faith who God had chosen, his character shows because he wakes up in the morning and he does not divorce her. But you need to understand, she would not have got the wedding. You understand that, right? She was the woman, she was the girl who got pregnant during the betrothal year. They're not going to celebrate. We debate even today within our churches how best to recognize someone who becomes pregnant before they're married. And can I tell you, we're nowhere near where they were when it came to such issues of purity. She did not get her wedding. In fact, I can tell you this, what she probably got were sidelong glances and hushed tones everywhere she went that stopped as soon as she got there. I'm sure that she was the subject of many conversations in that town, and I'm equally sure that she and Joseph were both aware of it. And then the Romans declare a census. And everybody has to go back to their hometown to register, and Joseph is from Bethlehem. I am convinced, and historians debate this, I am convinced Joseph took this as an opportunity to get Mary out of Nazareth. And he takes her to Bethlehem, his hometown, and this is when we're going to start stripping away things from the story that you have added. So just answer me as loud as that child. Ready? And so on the way, Joseph walks as Mary rides a... Where does it say that? Never says it. Never says that she rode a donkey. In fact, let me ask you this. She's pregnant. Nobody had a wagon? Joseph's a carpenter. He can't make a route. They have a donkey. The donkey can pull it. What would you have done? Hey, whatever. Kyle, she's pregnant. You're a carpenter. You have a wagon and a donkey. Do you put her on the donkey or do you pull her on a wagon? Makes much more sense. Read on your own. In fact, that's your homework. Call me if I'm a liar, but I'm not. Never says donkey. So they get there. They get to Bethlehem, and they got turned away at the... So she talked to an innkeeper? No! The Bible never... Mary never says that she ever got turned away from anything. You don't believe me? Never says it. It says, and there was no room at the inn. Little Linus holding this thing. You go, Don, you're cutting hairs, you're splitting hairs. Well, okay, first of all, it's Joseph's hometown. When you visit your hometown, what do you have there? Do you have relatives in your hometown? So you don't think that Joseph would have made plans to take his pregnant wife to a relative's house? What makes more sense? Oh, but you all don't believe me because you're going, what about the inn, Don? That's a problem. It says no room at the inn. How about if I told you that the room for inn is kataluma, the Greek word? It means guest room. Does that make sense? So does it make much more sense that they'd go to a family's house and there's no room in the guest room? Why would there be no room in the guest room? Because who else is there? Everybody else who showed up. You've been there. Raise your hand if you've been that lady. They're all coming. Every one of them. Even the night boys. Right? Guest room. So, I'll even keep going. So, of course, then It had to be a hurry, though. Had to be a hurry, didn't it? Because she was in labor when they were there, right? Does it say anywhere in Scripture? It simply says, while they were there, she gave birth in this guest room. Okay, but we know this, right? We know that Joseph and Mary, that she gives birth in the stable, right? Nobody's answering. Play along with me. The answer is always going to be no, but say what you would have said before tonight. She gives birth in a stable. What would you have said 10 minutes ago? No, it never says. It says she simply lays Jesus in a manger because there's no room in the guest room. So doesn't it make more sense that all those people and those women who had childbirth before would have assisted her? And then Joseph would have went out to this stable, which does it help to know that in many of these homes, the stable was like a garage attached to the house. Even the unearthed, I was going to get a picture, but I didn't. Steps going down to it. Does it make? But we know what? We know that little baby Jesus in that stable was surrounded by what? Animals. No, that makes no sense at all. Do you really mean to tell me, again, with all the Jewish rules and laws about purification and cleanliness, that Joseph, a devout Jewish individual, so devout that, should I say again, God chose him to raise his son, what would he have been doing out there with the mess and the animals if he was going to put God's child, his child, in a manger? Would there have still been animals out there? Makes no sense at all. And that manger, you should know, would have looked not like the pictures we have, but like a stone bassinet. Pretty much perfect for just such a thing. So, moving along, Mary, she had this child, and they put it in this manger that I'm sure Joseph had cleaned up because he had time. So Mary gives birth, and she wraps Jesus, and she puts him in this manger. She gets him calm. She finally rests, and a little boy with a drum set shows up. I mean, if we're going to add stuff, because everything you just added, you actually got from songs and you got from pictures and movies. Did you get that? That's everything you and I added. No, little drummer boy does not show up. Right? It doesn't matter because Jesus never cried. No crying. Let's just keep moving. But people do show up. Who showed up? Shepherds. Shepherds alerted, they showed up. Followed shortly thereafter that night by how many wise men? You're wrong indeed. First of all, it wasn't until 2 years later, so let me just keep going with this thing. The shepherds leave, and for roughly 2 years, this little family stays in Bethlehem. They do not return to Nazareth, and then one day a caravan pulls up. Pretty swanky-looking caravan. We don't know how long, how many people, and these foreigners knock on the door. Because this group of magi from the east, wise men, learned men, they had seen what always in their culture meant royalty, which was something in the sky. They had seen a star, and they were familiar with the prophecy of the birth of this king to the Jews, and so they traveled to Jerusalem, the center of Jewish life, and they get an audience with King Herod, who was evil. Go home and Google the things he did to his own family. And these wise men, they tell him about the star. And they ask, but we're not totally familiar. Where could we find this child who's the new king of the Jews? And so Herod schemes. And he gets his wise men together, and he says, okay, hit the books, guys. Where's the prophecy say the king will be born? And they tell him Bethlehem. So Herod tells them to go find the child. And then he says, but please, oh, do come back through. Tell me where the little child is so that I, too, might go worship the new king of the Jews. And they go about their way. And that's how the wise men from the east, 2 years later. But how many were there? There were more than 3 or less than 3 or 3. We don't know. Mary never reveals the number. All she says is that these people brought 3 of the most expensive gifts you could have. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And somehow over the years we thought it was, okay, Larry, what's your gift? One guy, right? All right? We have no idea how many wise men, how many magi were there, or magi, or let's just go with wise men. I like that better. But that's how these wise men from the east, we don't know how many, pull up to the dusty, tiny town of Bethlehem to welcome a king. And they enter the house where Mary was holding her 2-year-old-ish son. And again, Mary's the one writing the story. And as she remembered this, can you imagine the emotion she felt? 2 years it had been quiet. 2 years in Bethlehem, forging a life for this little family, when suddenly she was reminded this was no child that was ordinary. It was all real. Royalty, we don't know, but riches come from the east. By the way, a very heathen people. People who practiced Zoroastrianism from the land of Persia, probably. Heathens, pagans showed up to welcome Jesus into this world. The emotions. So, they are going to leave, and God appears to them in a dream. An angel says, don't go back to Jerusalem. Herod has a scheme to kill the child, and so they don't. So sometime between when they go back and Herod hears that they're not coming back, Joseph gets a dream, and he says, get out. Get the child, get Mary, and you get to Egypt right away. And so Joseph, again, now not just a man of faith being revealed to us, but Joseph, a man of action. He grabs them, and he gets out of town because Herod, he knows he's been duped by these wise men, however many they were all in cahoots. They weren't coming back to tell him nothing. So what's the next best thing? He can't go with pinpoint accuracy to take out one baby. So he sends a legion of army to take out all of them. So in Bethlehem one night, everything is turned upside down as the sound of swords against metal and horses neighing and people screaming and torches flickering in the candlelight within houses. Screaming erupts as within every home, these individuals, these mercenaries, these assassins, these murderers sent by Herod, they go in and they grab every child under the age of 2. They're supposed to kill just the boys, and that's what we know. But I can guarantee that in their haste, they probably weren't quite so accurate. They take them and they pile them up in the streets. They take them. The Bible, she doesn't say. She just says that he kills all of them. And I'm sure some of the mothers and the fathers in here would have also been killed protecting your baby. So, goes by for a while, and Mary hears about this, and she's in Egypt. And all she can think, I promise you, as she's remembering this, real people, real story, real emotions. I babysat those children. I knew every one of them. When you had your baby, who's not a baby anymore, when you had your baby, she's still enough of a baby to get your hands off her. When you had your baby, didn't some of you and your friends have children together? Didn't you know them? Didn't you babysit them? Didn't you talk? When Mary hears this story, it's not just, and babies were killed. It's she knows them by face. She can picture the mothers. She can picture the fathers. She knows them. She is responsible for their death, is she not in her mind? Because they were coming to kill who? Her son. And they're safe. Anybody in here ever have survivor guilt? As a parent, I can tell you it's real. Why not me? Real people, real story, real emotions. And so they stay there until Herod dies. And Joseph had another dream where the angel comes to him and says, it's time to move your family back to Nazareth. And so he does. Perhaps at this point, to continue to blow your mind, taking along their growing family. Who knows? We don't know who came next, but we know that he had 4 brothers and at least 3 sisters. They had to start sometime. So they go back to Nazareth. And with that, the Christmas story, the first phase of the greatest rescue mission the world has ever known, comes to a close. Pain and disappointment. Everybody who read my little thing, I called it, the title, some of you might say, they were like, well, that's a buzzkill. I want you to think about your past year and the year before that and maybe your life and those you know. And I want to ask you, the world as it is, does the world not resemble pain and disappointment for so many of us? Is this not the lot of human life in many ways? If not in your home, just look around the world. But Mary's story wasn't over, was it? Because as it turns out, the song, which many of you Mary, did you know you're... Yes, she knew. Can we just answer that? Who knows the song? Raise your hand. In fact, let's all do it. I'll do the Mennonite pitch pipe. Everybody, you haven't done it like we used to do it. Now you have to do it too. Maybe, do it. Do it. Let's ask the question. Mary, did you know your baby boy would... You get to the heart. Point is this, though. She knew. Read Luke again. No. I'd rather you not sing it around me either. Okay, I'm wrapping up. As it turns out, she knew. Mary did indeed know because she was familiar with Isaiah's prophecy that her son would be despised. Think of that. The hopes your child, you guys have hope for your children. You guys want the best for them. She knew from the moment that she knew who he was and was going to be, that he would be despised, Isaiah said, that he would be pierced, he would be crushed, he would be scourged, he would be killed. I want you mothers to think of living that your entire life, knowing that is the lot of your baby boy. Pain and disappointment. She's known that the last chapter of this story would break her heart. Now, I've talked to some guys who are smarter than me, or at least pretend to be, and they would say she didn't know the details. I'll give you that. But she was familiar with the outcome. And she had lived with that knowledge her entire life, the shadow looming in the back of her mind through all those years that many of us can relate to. She knew that the end would look much like the beginning. Mothers crying at the death of their sons. This is pretty big because the Christmas story, Mary's story, it was full of disappointment and pain. Because let's be real, Jesus entered the real world with mine, with all of our same disappointments. This real world that we all have with all of its uncertainties. Jesus entered this real world with all of its evil, senseless death and violence. It's the same world that you and I live in. So in this buzzkill of a message, which is anything but, what did Mary cling to? What did Mary cling to through all those years? Where did she focus her eyes when she doubted or she was hurting? On Jesus. I believe that it was Christ's presence that was proof of God's promise to Mary. He said she was going to get pregnant with his son, and she did. She also knew that he was to be Emmanuel, God with us, and he was. She understood all of that, and I'm sure that during those years, that's what she clung to. And so, today, in the middle of this huge, huge world that we get swallowed up in with all of its pain, with all of its disappointments, with all of its evil, with its senseless violence, with the argumentative tone that we all live with the questions we have within ourselves and the questions we have around us. What is it today that should give us peace also? Because can we not lie? As we look around us, is there anything to truly give us peace in this broken world? So I would say this Christmas, I would like you guys to consider that it is still Christ's presence within us, not those things around us, that we should cling to as proof of God's promises. Which was what? That God entered this world to bridge the gap between us. I don't think that's a buzzkill at all. I think just the opposite. I think this year, as you leave and you see Christmas lights and you see people dancing and you see people singing and all of these things that we celebrate, I want you to ask yourself this. In every one of the homes you're familiar with in this little town or the town you came from, are not there hurting people behind the curtains of all these beautiful houses? In fact, our house is all gussied up and glowing. Nothing in that house will ever be the thing that brings me to what I most truly desire. Nothing I will do or you will do will ever change the things around us in the way that will bring us peace like we want. But the fact that Jesus Christ entered this world 2,000 years ago, the very world that you and I live in, can make all the difference within us. And that will never disappoint you.